Take that fake metal off, or I'll have it removed for you. The judge's voice sliced through the quiet courtroom, sharp and impatient, echoing faintly against the high ceiling and polished wood. No one moved at first. The words hung there, heavier than they should have been, like something misplaced in a room built for order. Arthur Hayes did not respond. He sat in his wheelchair at the defense table, hands resting loosely on the worn fabric of his slacks, his back straight despite the years pressing down on him. 84 years old, and still there was a stillness about him that didn't belong to age. His eyes, pale and steady, were not on the judge. They were fixed on the American flag in the corner of the room, its colors muted under the fluorescent lights, its edges barely stirring in the conditioned air. Judge Richard Coleman leaned forward, irritation tightening his expression. He was a man used to compliance, to quick obedience, to the clean rhythm of authority being acknowledged without question. This silence disrupted that rhythm. "Did you hear me, Mr. Hayes?" he pressed, his tone sharpening, drawing a few uneasy glances from the gallery. "That medal is not recognized by this court. It is inappropriate and, frankly, suspicious." A faint murmur rippled through the room, quickly suppressed. The bailiff shifted his weight near the wall, leather belt creaking softly. At the prosecution table, a young man, Ethan Brooks, paused mid-note, his pen hovering above the page as his gaze flickered toward the old man. Something about the way Hayes sat there, unmoving, unbothered, felt off. Not defiant, not confused, just steady. The kind of steady you didn't see unless it had been earned somewhere far from places like this. Coleman exhaled sharply and rose from his bench, descending a single step as if proximity might force compliance. "I will not repeat myself again," he said, extending a hand toward the metal pinned neatly to Hayes's jacket. It was small, understated, its surface worn by time, lacking the polished gleam of ceremonial display. To most eyes, it looked ordinary. Forgettable, even. "Remove it," the judge ordered. Arthur Hayes finally moved. Not much. Just enough to shift his hand, slow and deliberate, resting it lightly over the metal, not shielding it, not hiding it, simply acknowledging its presence. His voice, when it came, was low and even, carrying further than expected. "No, sir." The words were calm, almost gentle, but they settled into the room with a weight that made the air feel tighter. Coleman's jaw set. "This is not a request," he snapped. "This is a court of law, not a place for." He stopped himself, eyes narrowing as he reached forward, fingers brushing the edge of the metal as if to remove it himself. The moment his skin made contact, something shifted, not in the room, but in the space between them. Hayes's hand closed gently around the judge's wrist. Not forceful, not aggressive, just firm enough to stop the motion. A quiet boundary drawn without effort. The room went still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to recede. Hayes lifted his eyes from the flag for the first time, meeting the judge's gaze. There was no anger there. No challenge. Just a depth that felt out of place in a courtroom on a Tuesday morning. Coleman hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for Ethan Brooks to feel it from across the room. Enough for something cold and unfamiliar to settle in his chest. Because suddenly, unmistakably, it felt like the judge was no longer the one in control. Judge Coleman slowly pulled his wrist back, the motion controlled but no longer certain, as if something unseen had shifted the ground beneath him. He straightened his robe, clearing his throat, trying to reclaim the rhythm that had just slipped through his fingers. "You will release me," he said, but the command lacked its earlier sharpness, softened by something he could not quite name. Arthur Hayes did. Instantly. No hesitation. His hand returned to his lap as if it had never moved at all. The metal remained exactly where it was. Untouched. Unmoved. Untaken. Coleman stepped back up toward the bench, each footfall slightly louder than necessary, as if the sound alone could restore authority. "Let the record reflect," he began, his voice rising, reaching for formality like a shield, "that the defendant is refusing to comply with a lawful order of this court." The court reporter hesitated for half a second before her fingers resumed their steady rhythm across the keys. In the gallery, the silence had changed. It was no longer passive. It carried weight now, attention sharpened, eyes narrowing not in curiosity, but in recognition of something unfolding. That did not belong to routine proceedings. Ethan Brooks felt it most clearly. He had seen hundreds of cases, minor disputes, procedural arguments, the predictable ebb and flow of authority. This was not that. His gaze fixed again on the metal, the small piece of metal that had disrupted everything. Something about it was wrong. Not fake. Not misplaced. Wrong in the way that something important looks when it is placed in the wrong setting. He leaned slightly forward, squinting, trying to catch the detail he had missed. The ribbon. The shape. The color pattern that seemed familiar in a way he could not immediately place. A faint pulse of recognition stirred at the edge of his memory, just out of reach. On the bench, Coleman pressed on. Faster now, words stacking on top of each other. This court will not tolerate theatrics or attempts to manipulate sympathy, he said, his voice tightening again as he regained momentum. If you will not remove the item voluntarily, I will have the bailiff do it for you. The bailiff did not move. Not immediately. His eyes flicked toward Hayes, then back to the judge, uncertainty threading through his posture. He had followed orders his entire career. This should have been simple. It was not. Hayes remained still, his breathing even, his gaze drifting once more toward the flag. The overhead lights cast a pale reflection across his face, revealing lines carved not just by time, but by something deeper, something that did not belong in a room filled with paperwork and procedure. Ethan's chest tightened. The recognition sharpened, clicking into place with quiet finality. He had seen that metal before. Not in person. In a photograph. In a briefing his father had once shown him, long before law school, long before courtrooms. He felt a sudden, unmistakable chill. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Ethan pushed his chair back. The faint scrape of wood against the floor seemed too loud in the silence. No one stopped him. No one even turned. All attention remained fixed on the center of the room, on the invisible line that had just been drawn. Ethan moved toward the aisle, his pulse quickening, a single thought forming with growing clarity. This is wrong. Not legally. Not procedurally. Something far beyond that. He reached the back doors of the courtroom and paused for only a fraction of a second, glancing once more at Arthur Hayes, who had not moved, who did not need to. Then Ethan stepped out into the hallway, already reaching for his phone, his fingers steady despite the weight settling in his chest, and as the door closed behind him, the silence inside the courtroom deepened, tightening like a held breath waiting for something no one could yet see. Ethan Brooks stepped into the hallway, and the door closed behind him with a soft, final click, cutting off the tension inside, but not the weight pressing against his chest. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, too bright, too sterile, a sharp contrast to the heavy silence he had just left behind. He moved a few steps away from the courtroom, his hand already pulling his phone from his pocket, his mind racing to catch up with what he now knew. He did not scroll aimlessly. He did not hesitate. His fingers moved with purpose, selecting a contact he had not used in years but had never deleted. The line rang once, then twice, each tone stretching longer than it should have, until finally a voice answered, calm, precise, and unmistakably military. Colonel Hayes. Ethan exhaled, steadying his voice. Sir, this is Ethan Brooks. I am calling about something happening in courtroom 3B. I would not be calling if it was not serious. There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, but calculation. Go ahead, the colonel said. Ethan glanced back at the closed courtroom doors, as if they might somehow hear him. There is a man in there. Name is Arthur Hayes. Elderly. Wheelchair. He is being ordered to remove a medal. The judge believes it is fake. Silence followed. Not empty. Not uncertain. Heavy. Then the colonel spoke again, slower this time. Describe the medal. Ethan swallowed, picturing it clearly now. Light blue ribbon. A single star. Worn. Not polished. It looks old, sir. Very old. The silence deepened. Ethan could almost hear something shifting on the other end, like a room suddenly standing still. When the colonel spoke again, his voice had changed. It was no longer casual. It carried weight. Stay where you are, he said. Do not let anything happen until I make a call. The line ended without goodbye. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, his grip tightening for a moment before he forced his hand to relax. He stood there, alone in the hallway, but the feeling of isolation was gone. Something had been set in motion. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Coleman adjusted his glasses and glanced toward the bailiff again, impatience returning in short, sharp bursts. "Well," he said, "are you waiting for a written invitation?" The bailiff hesitated, just long enough to be noticed, before taking a cautious step forward. His boots pressed softly against the floor, each step measured, uncertain. He approached Arthur Hayes with the careful posture of someone who understood, even if he could not explain why, that this was no longer routine. Hayes did not look at him. He remained still, eyes once again resting on the flag, as if everything unfolding around him existed at a distance. The metal caught the light faintly, a dull reflection that seemed almost out of place in the room's artificial brightness. The gallery watched in silence. No whispers now, no shifting, just attention, focused and unbroken. Coleman leaned forward slightly, his voice lower but more forceful. "Remove it," he said again, each word deliberate, controlled. The bailiff reached out, slowly, his hand hovering just inches from the metal. Then he stopped, not because he was told to, not because he was ordered otherwise, but because something in the air, something unspoken, made the simple act feel impossibly heavy. And in that suspended moment, somewhere far beyond the walls of the courthouse, phones were already ringing, lines connecting, names being spoken with a level of urgency that did not belong to a quiet Tuesday morning. And the stillness inside courtroom 3B tightened further, like the final seconds before something irreversible arrives. The bailiff's hand hovered in the air, suspended just inches from the metal, his fingers slightly curled as if waiting for permission that would never come. A single bead of sweat traced down the side of his temple, unnoticed by anyone but himself. He had carried out hundreds of orders in this room, each one simple, clear, unquestioned. This felt different. Not complicated, not confusing, just wrong. Judge Coleman exhaled sharply, the sound cutting through the stillness like a snapped thread. "This is not a negotiation," he said, his voice tightening again, reaching for control that seemed to slip further away with every passing second. "You will proceed." The bailiff swallowed, his hand inching forward again, slower this time, as if moving through resistance that no one else could see. Arthur Hayes did not move. Not his hands, not his shoulders, not even his gaze. The flag remained his focus, its quiet presence anchoring him in a way the room could not understand. The metal rested against his chest, unmoving, catching a faint flicker of light that seemed almost deliberate, as if it refused to be overlooked. In the gallery, a woman shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. A man beside her leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowed, as if trying to reconcile what he was witnessing with what he believed a courtroom was supposed to be. The air had changed. It was no longer just tense. It was expectant, as if something unseen was approaching, closing the distance with every second. Outside the courtroom, down a long corridor lined with polished floors and muted walls, footsteps moved quickly but with purpose, echoing faintly, then fading, then returning again from another direction. Doors opened. Voices spoke in low, urgent tones. Names were exchanged. Information confirmed. Each step in a chain reaction unfolding far beyond the awareness of those still seated inside. Back in the courtroom, Coleman's patience thinned further. "I will not be made a spectacle in my own court," he said, his voice rising now, frustration beginning to show through the cracks of formality. "If you will not comply, you leave me no choice." The bailiff's hand finally reached the metal. His fingers brushed the edge of the ribbon, light as air, as if testing whether it was real. The contact lasted less than a second before he pulled his hand back, almost instinctively, as though he had touched something he did not fully understand. The reaction was subtle, but it did not go unnoticed. A quiet shift moved through the room again, deeper this time. Coleman saw it. He felt it, and it angered him. "Enough," he said sharply. "Stand up or be assisted." The words echoed, hollow now, lacking the authority they were meant to carry. Arthur Hayes remained seated, unmoved, unshaken, his breathing steady, his presence unchanged. Time stretched thin, each second pulling longer than it should have, the silence pressing harder against the walls. Then, from beyond the closed doors, a new sound entered the space. Not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Firm, measured, not hurried, but not hesitant. The kind of steps that did not ask permission to enter. The bailiff turned his head slightly, just enough to hear it more clearly. A few in the gallery followed, their attention drifting toward the doors without realizing why. Even Coleman paused, mid-motion, his hand resting against the edge of the bench as the sound drew closer. The hallway beyond seemed to quiet in response, as if clearing a path. The footsteps stopped just outside. For a fraction of a second, everything held. Then the handle turned. The door opened without announcement, without hesitation, swinging inward just enough to reveal the figure standing beyond it before coming to a slow, deliberate stop. No one spoke. No one needed to. The presence alone was enough. A man stepped into the courtroom, tall, composed, dressed in a dark service uniform that carried weight without decoration needing to shine. The fabric was immaculate, pressed with precision, every line sharp, every detail exact. On his shoulders, for stars rested in quiet authority, not demanding attention, but commanding it all the same. The air in the room shifted instantly, like a current changing direction. Conversations that had not even begun died before they could form. Chairs creaked softly as people rose to their feet without being told. Not out of protocol, not out of obligation, but instinct. The bailiff straightened immediately, stepping back, his posture snapping into place with a clarity that had been absent moments before. In the gallery, confusion gave way to recognition in waves, subtle but undeniable, as eyes moved from the uniform to the man, and then quickly away again, as if holding his gaze too long required permission. Judge Coleman remained standing behind the bench, but the confidence that had filled his stance only moments ago had thinned, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. He adjusted his robe again, slower this time, his movements no longer sharp, no longer controlled. "This is a restricted proceeding," he began, his voice attempting to reclaim ground it had already lost. "You cannot simply," he stopped. Not because he chose to. Because the man did not look at him. Not once. The general's focus had already moved past the bench, past the authority it represented, settling instead on the figure seated at the defense table. Arthur Hayes had not turned. Not yet. The metal remained still against his chest, catching the same faint light. Unchanged by the shift in the room. The general took a single step forward. Then another. Each one measured, precise, the sound of polished shoes against the courtroom floor carrying farther than it should have. No one interrupted. No one moved to block him. There was no need. The space opened on its own. As he approached, something in the room seemed to settle into alignment, like pieces falling into place without effort. Arthur Hayes slowly lifted his gaze from the flag, turning his head just enough to meet the presence that had entered. For the first time, there was a change. Not in posture, not in control, but in recognition. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The general stopped a few feet in front of him, his expression composed, unreadable to most, but not empty, not distant. There was weight behind it, history behind it. A silence passed between them, not awkward, not uncertain, but understood. Behind them, the courtroom remained standing, frozen in a moment no one had prepared for. Judge Coleman opened his mouth again, searching for words, for structure, for authority, but none came. Because the room no longer belonged to him. It had shifted, completely, and everyone in it knew it. The general did not speak immediately. He stood there, close enough now that the details became undeniable, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the controlled stillness in his posture, the kind that did not come from discipline alone, but from years of carrying decisions that mattered. His gaze remained fixed on Arthur Hayes, and for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, nothing else in the room existed. Then, slowly, with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, the general raised his right hand. The motion was deliberate, exact, executed with the kind of respect that could not be mistaken or misinterpreted. He held the salute steady. The room froze. Not because anyone was told to. Because no one knew how to move in the presence of it. The weight of that single gesture settled over every person in the courtroom, pressing into the silence until it became something tangible. Arthur Hayes looked at him, truly looked this time, his pale eyes steady, unshaken, but now reflecting something deeper. Recognition. Not surprise. Not pride. Just recognition, as if this moment had always been inevitable. After a second, or perhaps longer, he lifted his own hand. Slower, older, but just as precise. The return salute was not weaker. It was not diminished. It carried a different kind of weight, one built over decades rather than rank. When his hand lowered, the general followed, his posture remaining straight, unwavering. Only then did he speak. "Sir," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying effortlessly across the room. "Permission to correct an error." The words were simple, but they landed with more force than any raised voice could have achieved. Behind him, the bailiff stood completely still, his earlier uncertainty replaced by something else entirely. Understanding, perhaps, though he could not have explained it. In the gallery, no one shifted. No one whispered. The stillness had become absolute. Judge Coleman blinked, the moment catching up to him in fragments, his authority unraveling piece by piece as he tried to process what he was seeing. "General," he began, forcing the word out, grasping for structure, for protocol. "This is highly irregular. You cannot just—" Again, the sentence fell apart before it could finish. Not interrupted, simply rendered irrelevant. The general did not turn toward him. Not yet. His attention remained exactly where it had been from the moment he entered. On Arthur Hayes. On the man seated quietly, who had not demanded anything, who had not raised his voice, who had not needed to explain himself. The metal rested against Hayes's chest, unchanged, but no longer unnoticed. No longer questioned. The general took a small step closer, his voice lowering slightly, not for secrecy, but for clarity. "This metal," he said, each word measured, deliberate, was awarded for actions that ensured others made it home. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The meaning settled into the room, filling the spaces where doubt had existed just moments before. Hayes said nothing. He did not confirm. He did not deny. He simply sat there, as he had from the beginning, the quiet center of a moment that had grown far beyond the courtroom itself. For the first time since the proceedings began, Judge Coleman had no immediate response. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, the practiced certainty gone. Because now, for the first time, he was no longer speaking from a position of control. He was reacting to something he did not understand. And everyone in the room could see it. The words settled into the room like a final piece falling into place, and with them came a silence so complete it seemed to absorb even the faint hum of the overhead lights. The general remained where he stood, his presence steady, unshaken, his gaze still resting on Arthur Hayes as if the rest of the courtroom no longer required acknowledgement. But now, something had changed. Not in Hayes. He remained exactly as he had been from the beginning. Still, composed, untouched by the rising and falling tension around him. The change was everywhere else. Judge Coleman shifted his weight behind the bench, his hand resting on the polished wood, fingers pressing slightly, as if grounding himself. The certainty that had driven every word he had spoken earlier was gone, replaced by hesitation he could not hide. "Be that as it may," he said, attempting to regain structure, though his voice no longer carried the same authority. "This is still a court of law. Procedures must be followed." The words sounded correct, formal, but they landed without force, like something rehearsed rather than believed. For the first time, the general turned his head. Slowly, deliberately. His eyes met the judge's, and in that brief connection, something shifted again, deeper this time. It was not confrontation, not aggression. It was something quieter, far more controlled. They were followed, the general said, his tone even, measured, each word precise. Long before this room existed, the statement did not rise in volume. It did not need to. It carried its own weight, filling the space between them with a clarity that left no room for argument. Coleman opened his mouth, then stopped. The response he had prepared dissolved before it could form. Around him, the courtroom remained standing, no one daring to sit, no one daring to break the moment that had taken hold. In the back, a faint movement caught the edge of attention as the doors opened again, this time more quietly, more cautiously. Ethan Brooks stepped back inside, his breathing steady, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper now, carrying the knowledge of what had been set in motion beyond these walls. He did not speak. He did not need to. He moved to the side, remaining near the back, his presence unnoticed by most, but not by the general. A brief glance passed between them. Acknowledgement. Nothing more. The bailiff straightened further, his earlier hesitation completely gone, replaced by a clarity of role he now understood without instruction. His hands rested at his sides, no longer reaching, no longer uncertain. The metal remained untouched. Untouchable now. Hayes shifted slightly in his chair, not from discomfort, not from pressure, but from the natural movement of someone who had been still for a long time. His eyes moved once more, briefly, from the general to the judge. Not challenging, not accusing, simply present. It was enough. Coleman felt it. Everyone did. The balance had changed completely. Authority had not disappeared. It had been redefined. And for the first time since the proceedings began, it was clear to everyone in the room exactly where it now stood. Judge Coleman drew in a slow breath, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift inside him. His hand remained on the bench, fingers no longer pressing, just resting there, as if the weight he had been holding had quietly slipped away. The courtroom did not move. No one sat. No one spoke. The moment stretched, no longer tense in the same way, but resolved into something heavier, something final. The general stood with the same composed stillness, his presence no longer an interruption, but a correction already made. Arthur Hayes remained seated, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, the metal resting against his chest exactly as it had from the beginning. Yet now it carried a meaning no one in the room could ignore. Coleman's eyes moved from the general back to Hayes, slower this time, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The assumptions, the dismissals, the certainty that had driven his earlier words had nowhere left to stand. He adjusted his stance slightly, straightening, but the movement lacked the sharpness it once had. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice quieter now, measured in a way it had not been before. "The court acknowledges that there may have been an error in judgment." The words were careful, chosen with precision, but they were not defensive. They could not be. Not anymore. In the gallery, a subtle shift moved through the crowd. Not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition that something had just been set right without argument, without escalation. The bailiff exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his shoulders easing slightly as the uncertainty that had held him in place dissolved. Near the back, Ethan Brooks remained still, his gaze fixed forward, watching as the outcome unfolded exactly as it should have, not because it had been forced, but because it had been revealed. The general finally turned his full attention toward the bench, his expression unchanged, his posture as composed as ever. "There is nothing to acknowledge," he said calmly. "Only something to remember." The statement settled into the room with quiet finality. It was not a correction of law. It was something deeper. Coleman nodded once, slowly, the motion small but undeniable. He did not argue. He did not push back. The authority he had relied on moments before had not been taken from him. It had simply been placed in proper perspective. "The court will proceed," he said after a brief pause, his voice steadier now, though different, grounded in something more measured. "And the defendant will retain all personal items." The words were formal, procedural, but they carried a weight that reached beyond the record. Arthur Hayes gave the slightest nod, not as acceptance, not as victory, but as acknowledgement that the moment had passed exactly as it needed to. The general stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but allowing the room to settle into its new alignment. Around them, the courtroom slowly followed, people lowering themselves back into their seats, movements quiet, deliberate, as if any sudden motion might disrupt what had just been restored. The flag in the corner stood unchanged, its presence constant, its meaning now felt more deeply than before. And in the stillness that followed, no one questioned the metal again. No one needed to. The courtroom settled into a quiet rhythm once more, but it was not the same rhythm that had existed before. Something had shifted beneath it, something that could not be undone or ignored. Papers moved softly across desks, voices resumed in measured tones, and the structure of the proceedings continued as expected, but every action carried a new awareness, a subtle weight that lingered in the air. Arthur Hayes remained where he was, hands resting calmly, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been from the moment he entered. The metal lay against his chest, no longer questioned, no longer examined, simply allowed to exist as it always had. Judge Coleman spoke again, his words, precise, controlled, but now tempered with a restraint that had not been there before. Each instruction was given carefully, each decision measured, as though the room itself demanded a different kind of authority than the one he had brought with him earlier. He did not look at the metal again. He did not need to. Across the room, the general stood for a moment longer, his role already complete. He did not linger for recognition. He did not wait for acknowledgement. His presence had never been about display. It had been about alignment. Slowly, he turned, his movements as deliberate as when he had entered, and began to walk back toward the doors. The path cleared without effort. No one spoke. No one stopped him. As he reached the exit, he paused just briefly, not turning fully, but enough to cast a final glance toward Arthur Hayes. It was not a check, not a question, just a confirmation. Hayes gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but enough. The general continued on, the door opening and closing behind him with the same quiet finality as before. The sound echoed softly, then disappeared, leaving the room to itself once more. In the gallery, people sat differently now. Straighter, more aware. Conversations, when they resumed, were quieter, more deliberate, as if each person understood they had witnessed something that did not belong to ordinary moments. Near the back, Ethan Brooks remained still for a second longer before returning to his seat, his notes untouched, his attention no longer on the case alone, but on the realization that some things carried weight far beyond any legal argument. The bailiff resumed his position, his posture firm, his role clear again, but his earlier hesitation had left a mark, a reminder that not every order was equal, not every action automatic. At the center of it all, Arthur Hayes sat in quiet composure, exactly as he had from the beginning, needing no validation, offering no explanation, his presence alone having been enough. The courtroom continued, the case moved forward, and the day carried on, but the silence that had filled the room moments before did not fully leave. It remained, faint but present, woven into the space as a reminder. Because respect, once revealed, does not need to be enforced. It only needs to be remembered.